Thank you everyone for joining us this morning at this morning's press briefing organised by Slow Food Europe and the European Environmental Bureau. I'm Ben Snelson. I work in communications at the EEB and I'll be moderating this briefing. I'll provide a quick background before passing to my colleagues to present to you, and we'll then welcome any of your questions at the end. But those colleagues are Marta Messa, Secretary General of Slow Food Europe, and Isabel Paliotta, Policy Officer for Sustainable Food Systems at the EEB. During the Q&A session, please make use of the raised hand feature and kindly introduce yourself, mention where you work and so on. But also feel free to add questions to the chat and I can put them to my colleagues in order. So today we'll be discussing a report being launched tomorrow on the Sustainable Food Systems Law. This report, endorsed by 23 organizations, is the outcome of a process of co-creation between many different civil society organizations, including European umbrella groups, which took place within the EU Food Policy Coalition, of which naturally the EEB and Slow Food Europe are members. The EU Food Policy Coalition brings together a wide range of stakeholders across the EU's food systems, from smallholder farmer organizations to NGOs working on human rights, the environment and animal welfare, but as well as think tanks as well. The content, positions and policy recommendations laid out in this report therefore bring together and represent quite an extensive range of perspectives from across civil society. The EU's Framework for Sustainable Food Systems, or the SFS law, is a cornerstone of the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, and the Commission's proposal for this is expected in the autumn of 2023. In pursuit of the EU's objectives regarding people's health, environmental well-being, and social equity, it is expected to initiate a major structural shift across Europe's food systems, spanning all sectors in the EU food supply chain. Since its publication, the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy and the legislation announced in it to support the achievement of those objectives have faced growing criticism and opposition, largely, as I'm sure you're all aware, from big industry players in the agri-food sector, including notably the pesticides lobby, but also food industry giants, many of which have vested interests in maintaining the status quo. These actors largely instrumentalized first the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine to push for less ambition in Farm to Fork and its constituent initiatives, including notably the SFS law. So this report emphasizes the major and unique opportunity presented by the SFS law and offers 4 key policy recommendations, which my colleagues will now discuss further. So without further ado, I think I can pass on to my colleague, Isabel, to kick off proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to quickly go over what the current food systems environmental challenges are and how the Sustainable Food Systems Law can address them, or rather the ones it should address. So right now, the food system as it currently functions has severe negative environmental impacts. It is also particularly susceptible or vulnerable to environmental degradation and climate change, so those the environmental impacts consequences in a way. The dire effects that the food system has on the environment are due to activities that are linked to the functioning and sustenance of a hyper-industrialized and globalized model of food production, processing and distribution, in which basically the linear extraction of resources is founded on excessive reliance on synthetic inputs and is guided by the maximization of profits. And that is in large part due to how food production has been managed over the past 60 years in the EU, whereby the necessary focus on increased productivity back in the 50s and 60s has morphed into an obsession with continuously increasing production. But it is now blatant that we really can't keep on squeezing food out of our soils and water and ecosystems more generally. And particularly in the last few years, we've seen that the environmental the degradation of land and biodiversity and climate change are already disrupting food production and availability across Europe. In some cases, something that they had already been doing in food systems in the global south for quite a few years. And that clearly needs to change, otherwise we will not be able to ensure food security for current and future generations of Europeans. The environmental impacts of our current food system are impinging very heavily on key planetary boundaries, and that's most notably the loss of biosphere integrity. So that's loss of biodiversity and species extinction, the biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. And these two planetary boundaries already being well beyond the so-called zone of uncertainty, but also land system change, for which we are currently in the zone of uncertainty. The food system related activities globally contribute to about a third of overall greenhouse gas emissions, as well as, of course, as I've already mentioned, dire effects and soil depletion and dire effects on biodiversity. So in Europe, the impacts of the climate and biodiversity crisis vary a lot, depending on different regions. But there is actually already an abundance of research showing both how yields have been affected over the past decades of intensified agricultural production and what we can expect in terms of yield and profits lost in the coming years. So as an example, we can take wheat, which has been at the center of the latest sort of food security discourse and narrative in relation to the war in Ukraine. But if we consider from a climate change perspective, so in a 2-degree temperature rise scenario, wheat yields in Europe will decrease by 12% to up to 50%, depending on the region. So we're looking at extremely serious losses. Whereas if we still remain at the EU level, but shift our focus from climate change to biodiversity degradation, the alarming rate at which pollinator numbers are decreases will lead to a 25 to 30% loss in crops relying on pollination, if that's not halted or reversed, of course. And let's keep in mind that about 85% of food crops depend on pollination. So we're looking at extremely serious perspectives. So why the SFS law? Because the EU is a major and extremely powerful player in the global food system and has set itself some very important objectives in the farm to fork. And the SFS law is a vital opportunity for the EU to lay the foundations for a union-wide transition to sustainable food systems that can provide healthy and sustainable diets to everyone. And doing so by supporting helping us stay within planetary boundaries, as well as contributing to the protection and restoration of natural resources, ecosystems, and so on and so forth. So that's me on the environmental challenges of the food system. And I think I'm going to pass it on to Marta to look at the other challenges we have to address.
Thank you, Isabel. Indeed, so just to give you an overview, and these are all data that are widely cited and that you find reported properly in the report that we're going to launch tomorrow, in the policy paper we're going to launch tomorrow. But looking at some numbers around the health crisis and the social challenges. Today, around 38 million people in the EU face some degree of food insecurity, with a trend that has been growing since 2015, plus with COVID 2019 and the war in Ukraine. European diets, and it's also widely documented, are key drivers of non-communicable diseases. including cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers. And in 2019 alone, the EU lost over 814,000 citizens due to premature deaths associated with unhealthy diets. So the numbers are very clear and stark. In terms of social challenges, we do know we are observing power imbalances and the corporate capture that skew the food system towards a profit-driven model. Globalized supply chains amplify these dynamics, and what we are witnessing is human rights violations, dire working conditions, and economically unsustainable livelihoods, especially touching seasonal workers and small-scale farmers in the EU as well as abroad. And these are precisely the same people who have the least access to and representation in policymaking. Specifically in Europe, this concentration of market and financial power in the hands of ever fewer agribusinesses and food industry actors is having a significant influence and sway on policy debates. And what we're seeing is a lot of proposals in terms of silver bullet solutions like end-of-pipe technologies, enhancing efficiency, instead of looking at sustainability comprehensively. And what we're also seeing is like proposals for greater economies of scales, favoring intensification and specialization, instead of looking at systemic and transformative approaches like dietary changes, agroecology, social innovation, and so on. Let me use this chance also to say very clearly, as I'm addressing the issue of power imbalances, what we're presenting here is a document prepared by 23 organizations from the Food Policy Coalition, 23 organizations that represent food actors across this food system. I'm saying this because often in the EU debate, there is a narrative of the farmers versus the environmentalists. This is not what we're presenting here today. This is not what we're presenting tomorrow. What the policy paper suggests, it's really a comprehensive approach, and it comes from the experience of both farmers' organizations, food movements, environmentalist organizations, animal welfare organizations, and so on. So it's very a broad spectrum. So given all these challenges that Isabel explained and that I gave a look into in terms of more the social and health challenges, we do see the EU Sustainable Food Systems Law as a real opportunity. And that is why indeed these 23 organizations, part of the Food Policy Coalition, prepare this policy paper that is going to be launched tomorrow. Our colleagues will be sending you more details in terms of the event details. And in the report, we present 4 priorities and associated policy recommendations that the SFS law should enshrine to build a consistent and comprehensive policy approach. And these 4 recommendations, I'll just summarize them here, then I'll look at the first 2, and Isabel will explain the last 2. But they look at taking a food systems approach. The second one is setting a new governance framework for the EU food system, developing enabling food environments, and the 4th is ensure strong accountability and fairness through the food chain. So I look here at the first 2, the food systems approach and the new governance framework. First of all, what we're seeing as our recommendation in terms of the overarching objective of the SFS law is that it must enable the transition to environmentally, socially, economically sound, fair, and healthy food systems. And these should be broken down into specific objectives, this overarching objective, that address the following imperatives. First of all, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and any other forms of pollution and any adverse impacts on biodiversity from the food system as a whole by setting clear targets against which progress can be monitored. Ensure that everyone, including future generations, can access sustainable, healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate diets. Provide safe and dignified working conditions and a fair income to all producers and workers through the food system, and create conditions where all food systems actors can effectively participate and shape policies in a democratic way. And last but not least, in terms of the imperatives that we're looking at to outline the objectives, is urgently end all socially and environmentally harmful subsidies. And so align also investments in public spending and private financing with the objectives of the law and the EU Farm to Fork and Biodiversity strategies. So to do so, apologies, we're a bit in the office today. I hope you can hear me just okay. So to do so, what we're suggesting in the paper is that the SFS law should embrace fundamental principles, both existing ones, but also add new ones. Among the existing ones, we're, for instance, mentioning the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principles, and any principles requiring preventive action to anticipate and avoid or correct any damage, the right to food and nutrition, and the right to a healthy environment, and the right to public access to information and participation in governance, which is, by the way, part of the Aarhus Convention and EU law. So these are the existing ones. Of the additional ones, what we are saying that should be included is basically internalizing any negative externalities. So the cost of negative externalities must be reflected in food prices. We're talking about enshrining in the SFS law the respect of planetary boundaries and fair sustainable governance. Now, this food systems approach, for us, it's fundamental because sustainability cannot be assessed at the scale of individual products and must instead be evaluated by considering the wider system from which food products result and within which they're processed, transported, sold, consumed, and disposed of. Said in a different way, we're not like we're having meals, we're not eating individual products. So this is just a way of saying we need to look at the whole food system as a whole, not just at the individual product. So in terms of the second recommendation, setting a new governance framework for the EU food system, the rationale is the following. There is wide evidence that there is a lack of policy coherence in food-related policy that is running contrary to key principles of EU law. Policy coherence is part of the Treaty of the European Union and clearly is also an obstacle to transition. The most recent report of the European Environmental Agency dating April 20th is going into detail looking at the lack of policy coherence and how that is blocking any substantial transition towards more sustainable systems. We do know that many EU policies affect European food systems, agriculture, trade, food safety, environment, animal welfare, you name it, it's a long list. And these policies have been developed in isolation over the years. These like separate policy working in silos has led to a multiplication of objectives and policy tools in an inconsistent and inefficient ways. Even indeed the European Environmental Agency report was even saying that even individual policies over time have become at times inconsistent within themselves. So we have these multiple layers of inconsistencies. So what is the solution is that the SFS law must put forth concrete measures to restructure the governance of EU food policies and their implementation. And this involves a few things. Clearly, as I said, tackling policy incoherence, making sure that a wider set of actors, sectors and stakeholders have a say in food-related policymaking. And this means also involving national and local bodies, national and local authorities who do carry out very significant actions and policies and who can implement very important initiatives in terms of the transitions. And so if we're also looking then at these different levels of governance from the EU going all the way down to the national level, then we need to have coordinated actions, both at the EU member state level, but also at the national and subnational level so that they're all coherent. So more specifically, in terms of the recommendations for the new governance framework, there are 4 specific things to keep in mind. So first of all, the SFS law should provide an effective framework, and in that sense, set the direction of travel. And what does that mean? Set mechanisms to make food policies consistent, establish common objectives that are aligned with the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, and avoid contradictions. So this is very concretely like how the SFS law can set the direction. As a second step, what we need is to redefine institutional structures and support food democracy. What does that mean? Have better competence sharing. How do we achieve that? What we are suggesting in the paper is that EU-level policy-making competencies and responsibilities with regard to food policies should be distributed across all relevant Directorate Generals of the European Commission, as well as within different council formations and parliament committees. And so at the EU level, we imagine this kind of we recommend this kind of sharing of responsibilities. And we're also recommending, in terms of supporting food democracy, to encourage the creation of food policy councils, many of which already exist at EU level, establish a European Food Policy Council, so have one overarching at EU level, and recognize the key role and responsibilities of cities and local authorities. Furthermore, what we're saying is that we need to elevate the social innovation and locally led experimentation and support it. And when we talk about social innovation, we mean, for instance, community support schemes and farmers markets, all the way to citizens panels. These exist. They can show us how we can be more effective in democratic processes. And as a final recommendation, we also want to strengthen and recognize the value of the European Citizens Initiative as an effective tool. So again, SFS law give the overall direction, then we need to redefine institutional structures and the spaces where policies are developed and responsibilities are shared. And then, still in terms of the governance framework, what we are recommending is that we should frame member states' involvement through national sustainable food plans. Now, this builds on the very positive experience of the EU climate governance. And what we are suggesting in the paper is that the national sustainable food plans would be the way in which national and local authorities set how they will deliver on the objectives of the SFS law. Again, building on the EU climate governance, these plans should be revised regularly. There should be yearly public reports on progress against quantitative and qualitative indicators, and there should be an independent agency, such as the European Environmental Agency, that has the competence to scrutinize implementation, give recommendation, and advise essentially the European Commission and member states. So, and just as the member states' national sustainable food plans should be monitored against concrete targets, the same should happen in terms of the SFS law as a whole. So what we're suggesting is to have science-based and time-bound targets covering key environmental and social dimensions of sustainability, a robust policy monitoring and evaluation framework, and an independent evaluation. So again, this closes these first two sets of recommendations on having a food systems approach and setting an effective and democratic governance system. I'll hand it back to Isabel for the last two recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you very much. So picking up where you left off on the need to have a food systems approach to reshaping European food systems and making them socially and environmentally sustainable, we really believe the SFS law can't avoid addressing the consumption side, of course. That's basically diets, as well as fairness and accountability, particularly in relation to actors whose interactions and relations are defined by stark power imbalances. And that's the focus of our last two policy recommendations. So starting from our third, that's developing enabling food environments. I'll give you a bit of a background on what this means. From a policy perspective, the EU has a lot more experience in a way with dealing, developing production level food policy, read the CAP. But of course, diets we can't really think of a food system if we don't consider diets. So it's very promising. It was very promising to see that when the Farm to Fork was published, indeed the EU and the Commission was setting out to move on to a more comprehensive EU level consumption side food policy. So both at the EU level, that little that there was, and at the national and other levels of governance, consumption side food policy has historically relied on what is referred to as the consumer responsibility narrative. Within this view, basically the consumer responsibility narrative is based on the premise that people will make the best possible choices if they are provided with the best possible information, which is a notion that has been discredited by sociological and psychological research for about 40 years. And the policies that derive from this kind of approach rely on basically providing that information to consumers. So basically labeling and similar kinds of measures. However, food consumption choices are determined by a much more complex combination of factors and influences, which are referred to in brief as the food environment. And the definition of the food environment, as given by the UN's high-level panel of experts on food systems and nutrition, which is hosted within the FAO, they're described as the physical, economic, political, and sociocultural context in which consumers engage with the food system to make their decisions about acquiring, preparing, and consuming food. So it's sort of the interface between us and the food system. And today, food environments are disproportionately shaped by profit-driven interests of private actors, and that's particularly the case in the middle of the particularly by actors that are in the middle of the food supply chain. That's retailers, advertisers, processors, the food service sector, companies dealing with marketing of food products, and so on. So in our policy report, and what we advocate for is that the SFS law introduce strong EU-level measures on public and private procurement and marketing, which are key levers of change in order to foster an enabling food environments in which the healthy and sustainable choices are the default ones. So they're the most advertised, the most accessible, the most available, the most attractive, the most culturally appropriate. That has to tie into and take into consideration the fact that many competences relating to food consumption actually lie at the national level. And this ties back to what Marta was just saying about recommending the SFS law introduce or require member states to develop national sustainable food plans in alignment with the overarching objectives of the set in the SFS law, in order precisely to address those levels, such as public procurement, quite notably, but also pricing and fiscal policies, and so on and so forth. And we can go more in detail on public procurement. If you have questions on that, within the Food Policy Coalition, we also recently developed a manifesto for sustainability requirements in public procurement across Europe, so we can pick that up. But I'll move on to our last recommendation so that we can then pick up any questions and go into more detail on what's needed. So our last recommendation pertains to the need for having strong accountability and fairness throughout the food chain. Food chains in our current food systems are extremely unfair, and they are defined by a stark lack of accountability. The fact that food is treated as just like any other commodity rather than a common good, something that if we stop and really concentrate on it is quite disturbing, actually, has led to the creation of a context in which private interests run the show in a way. They run and they define food systems. And that doesn't mean that there aren't many companies that have placed sustainability and human well-being at the center of their operations, but that's definitely not the norm yet. And the norm being that profits come before both people and the planet. And this is particularly the case, as I briefly mentioned, when we look at actors in the middle of the food supply chain, which has been defined by increasing verticalization and concentration of power, particularly in the last 30 years. And that has resulted in very few, very large and powerful players controlling the lion's share of the market and having a massive influence on the food system. And that's something that also has a massive effect on our food environment, because indeed, if we consider the actors that are placed there, so again, retailers, if we think of the retailer chains that are really cross-border, you can find them in every member state, and of course processors, distributors, and so on. They really have a massive sway over what we have access to, what is most marketed, what is most pushed in a way, and that therefore what we tend to consume more. Now, there's abundant research at this point on showing that the lack of binding regulatory measures, both at the EU and at the EU level and internationally, the lack of strong regulatory measures to hold transnational corporations, including the financial sector, which is an increasingly relevant player on the scene, holding those actors accountable for their operations across food systems is one of the main obstacles to a transition to a more sustainable food system. So the combination of this increasing power concentration that I was referring to in agri-food value chains and this regulatory weakness in a way also has a dire effect on farmers themselves, who are forced into what can be defined as a sort of price-taking position. They are squeezed by more powerful players, and they therefore also have a very hard time transitioning to more sustainable production methods and so on, which tend to require quite consistent early day investments. So in our policy report, what we recommend is that sectors that have a negative impact on the achievement of the Farm to Fork and SFS laws' social and environmental sustainability objectives should be placed under much stricter regulation, be it at the EU or national level, depending on the area of competence, of course. And more specifically, we believe that addressing the issues of fairness in our food system is also, let's say, a key part of the picture and tied to, of course, questions of accountability. So in regulatory terms, shall we say, this touches upon unfair trading practices. This is the case, for example, in the food chain law in Spain, where that makes it illegal to purchase food produce below production costs. But it also touches upon measures on corporate responsibility that are really key, particularly for those very, very big and powerful middle chain actors. Whereas if we take a step back and take a more systemic view, the overall direction of travel set for the food system in the SFS law should be that of transitioning to what can be defined as a value chain of mutual responsibility. So a value chain in which actors take responsibility or are held accountable in order for them to internalize the costs of all of the environmental and social impacts they have when carrying their operations out, what in technical terms is referred to both scope 1 and scope 3 emissions, if we're looking at environmental sustainability, basically. Now, Marta mentioned it briefly, but I'll make the point again. The EU trade policy really needs to be brought in line with Farm to Fork objectives as well, and that should be something the SFS law addresses. So we really need to move away from the current focus of our trading system on ever increasing imports and exports aimed at profit maximization, as these are driving environmental degradation, human rights violations, as well as wreaking havoc in local food markets. And the policy measures that could help address this are measures shifting the responsibility and the burden of responsibility on importing companies, rather than having those externalities fall back on more vulnerable players, particularly in the global south. So some examples of policy measures that could support that transition are the introduction of mirror clauses in trade agreements, fair mirror clauses. So mirror clauses that basically make it so that the same standards of environmental and social sustainability that are imposed on the internal market are required for products imported from abroad, in due consideration of the livelihoods of the workers and food system actors in those third countries, but also robust liability mechanisms, particularly for traders importing raw agri-food products, and finally expanding due diligence to all food imports.
Isabel, could I just come in there just to ask if we can?
We're done.
So we have enough time for all questions.
I was on my last bullet point. Yes, thank you, Ben. And finally, I just had a quick reference to existing policies such as the IEU regulation to prevent and eliminate illegal and unreported fishing, and the deforestation and forced labor regulations. These are all things that do exist and are first steps in the right direction. But yeah, that's it. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Isabel, and thank you, Marta, both of you, for that excellent taster for what's to be included in tomorrow's report. So now I guess it's time to turn over to listen to you who've joined us this morning. And if anybody in the room has questions, we'll come to you first. So if you want to make yourselves known by raising a hand, if you have something to say. Just got a message in the chat from Julien. Problem with your mic, no worries. A quick question on new genomic techniques regulation, which is expected to be part of the SFS EU proposals in June. Are there any concerns on this, and what could be the balance on this text? Julien.
Isabel, is it okay? Or Ben, I don't know if you want to first say call questions.
No, let's go one by one, I think. If one of you feels comfortable with this one, go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Isabel, if it's okay, I can give it a stab. Okay, excellent. In terms of the new genomic techniques, which we as civil society have called new GMOs, because the European Court of Justice basically stated that they should be treated as GMOs, hence the reason why we call them that way. Our concern is that indeed they fall outside the scope of the GMO legislation. What we are asking is that indeed the European Court of Justice decision is respected, and that means traceability, assessment, transparent labeling also for new genomic techniques. We, the Food Policy Coalition per se is not working on the topic of new genomic techniques. There's another coalition of organizations working on that, of which Slow Food is part, and there's been quite a bit of campaigning happening around these. My colleague Madeleine Cost, who's also the call, she's been following closely the topic. So if there are any more specific questions to that, I'd be happy also for her to take the floor and give you more detail on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Rose, I saw you did have a hand up, but it's no longer there. Yeah, go ahead if you'd like to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Thank you to both ladies, Marta and Isabel, for a really comprehensive overview of what's in your report tomorrow. My one fear is that you give a very in-depth view of the policy recommendations and what you would like to see in the SFS law. My fear is that what will be presented in September might not meet those expectations. In terms of sort of what I've been hearing, it's very hard to get a very straight answer out of any DG Santé official as to what will be in this SFS law. I'm not sure if that's the sort of message you're receiving from colleagues in the Commission. But one thing I picked up since I wrote on the impact assessment back in February was that there's even difficulties and divergent views on the EU-wide definition of sustainability underpinning food systems. Now, that's a big question, but even at political level between the Director Generals, apparently there's, as I say, divergent views as to how one might define such a broad spectrum approach. Just wondering, what are you hearing on that? That's fairly fundamental to the whole legislation. And what sort of suggestions or policy directions would you like to see in terms of the definition of sustainability? Would it apply? I mean, it's probably a question of applying it to all of those links in the food chain that you've sort of so well described in your introductions. I also just had a specific question for Marta. You mentioned the European Food Policy Council in the context of better governance of food systems. Maybe if you could dig down on that a tiny little bit, Marta. And just in general, I know you got your event tomorrow with Mr. Lukas Wischek. Are you expecting any sort of announcements or any sort of visions on the direction of travel that might appease this appetite we have for specific details on the SFS law? And again, well done on your report, very comprehensive. Your policy recommendations are extremely clear. But again, my fear is that what will be presented in the SFS law will be more of a series of principles, and then the digging down will be sort of allocated to delegated acts at a later stage, given the sort of political pushback that we've seen, as Ben outlined in his introductory comments. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Marta, shall I go? Sorry, Ben.
Go ahead, Isabel. I can take the one on the Food Council.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rose. Indeed, we share your concerns. We had a look at that February version of the impact assessment. We know Sante will be meeting the Regulatory Scrutiny Board in these very days, possibly with the final version of the impact assessment they've carried out. And indeed, so the rationale here was the Commission has had to, in a way, adapt and react to the geopolitical context. We do see a lot of goodwill coming, especially from DG Sante, in terms of coming out with something that is ambitious and meaningful, and that can carry through to the next Commission, and particularly the next Parliament, and be something that is not just dropped. So it's a balancing act. It really is. It really looks like that's what they're having to do. What we saw was very promising, for example, in relation to public procurement. But indeed, I do have to concur with you that what we can expect is mostly something based, a very general framework. This is also what we've been hearing from them. So the idea of setting out something which has some strong enough objectives and principles to shape the then ensuing delegated acts further down the line. Obviously, a lot of how this goes, if they're successful in this objective, depends on how the elections go. This is one extra note, because we're talking about food policy specifically, is that there'll be another very delicate balancing act to be done between the EU and the national level, because food policy is something that member states tend to be very jealous about, in a way. It's their realm, it's what they work on. They approach it mostly through nutrition and national dietary guidelines. But here we're looking at integrating environmental sustainability and trying to initiate something which is EU-wide. So it's a massive and very, very complicated feat. But yeah, that's why our recommendations keep the level of ambition really high, so that at least we can sort of try and push as much as we can. And to address your point on the definition of sustainability, that's a really tricky one. Because of course, once you define sustainability or sustainable food systems, or even more so sustainable food, then that informs how you evaluate the sustainability and the indicators you use, and so on and so forth. So there's one risk, which is that if the definition is too wide, it's meaningless. If it's too strict, then it doesn't give space for any sort of adaptation, and it's too specific and too technical. So what we've been working with within the coalition is considering the definition of sustainability more in terms of a sort of operational definition. So not what is a sustainable food system, but what should a sustainable food system do? And for this, we actually refer back to the SAPEA report on sustainable food systems back from 2020. And that means that we consider and believe that a sustainable food system is a food system that provides easily accessible, sustainable, healthy diets to everyone at all times, stay safely within planetary boundaries, and that links us back to the new principles we believe the SFS law should introduce. So a clear and explicit reference to keeping our food system within a safe operating space, that it be managed and shaped by representatives of all relevant stakeholders at all levels of governance. And this will link back to your second question that Marta will address, I believe, and as well as providing dignified working conditions and a fair income to all workers employed in it, everywhere, linking back to my reference early on to the Global South, and of course ensure the highest possible animal welfare standards. So it's more sort of a question of ticking all the right boxes rather than providing a definition of sustainability that then has to be translated into operational terms. So that's been the perspective so far.
I'll jump in on the question on the European Food Policy Council, and then Isabel, if you feel like anything should be complemented, do not hesitate to jump in. What we're saying in the document is that it doesn't go too much into the details. It says that the European Food Policy Council should be there to support civil dialogue and strengthen the links between EU-level action and local governance structures. Maybe the one thing that I can just add is that we do clearly have experience with the civil dialogue spaces offered so far at EU level. We do know, and there have been lots of exchanges on that as well, how the Ombudswoman has intervened in the past in terms of the lack of representativeness and of not effective democratic mechanisms. So we do have experience to build on, essentially, to really make sure that should the European Food Policy Council come to exist, then we would really put pressure not to repeat the same mistakes we've witnessed so far. But Isabel, if there's anything else to be added, please do not hesitate. But otherwise, in terms of the expectations, in terms of the declarations by Lucas Visek, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know, Isabel, if you have any expectations specifically about this. Of course, we hope there will be, comments in terms of the timeline. We do expect that in terms of the timeline of the SFS law. But I don't know if beyond that, if there is anything that we can reasonably expect. But Isabel, over to you in case you have more intelligence on this.
No, and so much of the timeline will be defined by the feedback of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which, as they're meeting this week, it's very early for them to know that. In terms of expectations, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's likely that the RSB will come back with no feedback, please go ahead, do carry on. But what we have been hearing from the Commission so far is that they mean to and expect to keep the proposal publication slot for September. So yeah, indeed, I mean, depending on the feedback coming from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, that could be doable or extremely unlikely.
Thank you both for those responses. There's no other questions from anybody in this virtual room, but we do have 3 questions that have come.
Ben, you muted us yourself accidentally, I think.
Sorry, there are 3 questions which came from journalists who weren't able to attend in person, and those are: firstly, what is the status of insects and products derived from insects within the EU food system, and to what extent, if any, are insects and products derived from them addressed in the EU SFS law? Would anybody like to take that one?
I can take that one. So to our knowledge, as far as we know, those are not addressed in the EU Sustainable Food Systems Law. But again, as Isabel was also mentioning, like there are rough indications we're receiving from the Commission. So we have no certainty whether they will or will not be addressed in there. And essentially, in terms of what is the status of insects and products derived from insects within the EU food system, so essentially they are regulated at the moment under the novel food regulations, because that regulation explicitly considers whole insects as novel foods. They can be authorized if they pose no risk to human health, and there is a strict, stringent risk assessment by the EFSA. In terms of, like, we didn't discuss this specific topic within the group of 23 organizations drafting the policy brief on the SFS law. What we can say in general that, as you know, we've been referring to the objectives of the SFS law, and as I was saying, it's not about analyzing an individual product, but it's about analyzing the how the food system as a whole can transition towards greater sustainability by ticking the boxes that Isabel was mentioning before, in terms of not of the definition of sustainability per se, but how do we operationalize it. Then this would apply also to, say, the topic of insects. So just seeing how this can potentially or not contribute to the overarching objective of the SFS law. But we haven't drafted, we haven't come up with a specific position on that, and certainly, and it doesn't come up in our policy brief that you'll find tomorrow.
Thank you, Marta. The second question was, just find it. How can we make the public procurement of food more sustainable if the GPP are voluntary? How can we push to introduce more organic products and reduce food waste in public canteens?
Marta, if that's okay, I can pick that one up. Yeah, so the second part of the question, I think, can be answered by just addressing the first part in a way, because reducing food waste and introducing more organic products in public canteens is strictly linked to ensuring that measures relating to public procurement are effective and meaningful. So indeed, in the manifesto that we developed within the Food Policy Coalition, of which I believe Madeleine shared a link in the chat, I think I saw that. Yeah. So that within that manifesto, you can find all of our recommendations fleshed out and expressed in terms of policy measures, and also specific targets and objectives for sustainability considerations in the public procurement of food. One thing that I do want to sort of raise my hat to the Commission is that what we saw in the leaked impact assessment back in February is that actually their preferred policy option for public procurement is the most ambitious one, and indeed the one that we would have recommended, i.e. The introduction of mandatory general and specific requirements for public procurement. So indeed, the requirements would, at that point, not be voluntary anymore. And so how that would work would be that the SFS law would introduce a sort of general requirement of procuring food sustainably in public institutions, be that school canteens, social canteens, and so on, touching on both food service and vending machines. And with a clear reference and consideration of all three dimensions of sustainability. A lot of, so great point, mandatory, but which are the indicators, which are the elements of standards that would be taken into consideration? Open question in terms of the ones that we would prioritize, and they are, again, fleshed out in the manifesto linked in the chat. But they would, there are 7 different dimensions that would, types of criteria relating to healthy food, organic and other agricultural products, So here comes the organic side, let's say, the support to small-scale farmers and local supply chains, climate action, of course, decent working conditions, fair trade and animal welfare. So already in that, there's a sort of, I think, the link with the dimensions of sustainability of a food system that I was listing earlier is quite evident. So this brings us back to coherence across policy areas and measures, trying to sort of make those ends meet and so on. So I don't know I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Isabel. And I'm conscious of time, we're at 11 o'clock, but we have one final question, which is quite a short one. So who or what organization leads this grouping of the 284 organizations campaigning on the issue of the SFS law?
Isabel, if okay, I can take this one. So I guess the question is coming because indeed in the invitation there was the mention of 284 organizations signing a letter on the need for a strong proposal on an EU legislative framework for sustainable food systems. This letter dates back to February 2023. It was indeed initiated by the Food Policy Coalition. Thank you for the link, Madeleine, in the chat. It was initiated by the Food Policy Coalition, but there isn't per se like a lead of this group of 284 organizations. So the Food Policy Coalition, which per se is composed of over 50 organizations from animal welfare organization, environmental, farmers and fisheries, public health, social justice, and so on, started this letter and put it out for basically for organization to support it by signing it. And so that's the story of the letter and the 284 organizations, but the overall of the group is not led by any specific coalition.
Thank you, Marta. So there aren't any other questions in the room, so I think that draws us to a close today. Thank you so much to both of our speakers this morning, and for those of you who have joined us. It's been a pleasure having you. Two quick things to mention. First of all, this recording will be made available to all of you, and we will send that after this. And also, secondly, perhaps more importantly, you're all most welcome to join also at the report launch tomorrow at the L42 Centre in Brussels, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But if you're not around, no worries. I'm sure you can still read the report without having to attend the event. So that brings us to a close, and thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Monday.